Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining us this time on the Ask Historians podcast. I'm user SteelCan909 here, joined today by Mr. Max Miller from the YouTube channel and published author of Tasting History. I'm going to go ahead and let him introduce himself and talk about a little bit about what he does if you're unfamiliar with his work. And then we're just going to kind of go right into talking about how public history works and what makes it different between the academic side, what makes it different from a more pop history side, how things like YouTube kind of change that dynamic between historians and audience. But I'll go ahead and let him take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. As you said, my name is Max Miller. I am the host of Tasting History on YouTube and the author of the Tasting History Cookbook. Basically, the conceit of my show is every week I find a recipe from history, going all the way back 4,000 years, all the way up to, the 1950s and 60s. And then I do my best to recreate that recipe. And the further back you go, the harder it is to do that because recipes were not always the best written in the past, but that's part of the fun. And then I talk about the history of the food or something associated with the food, whether it be a specific event in history or just about the people or the culture that were eating the food.
All right. Well, so let's go ahead and start off with why tasting history. So, I mean, I've watched a lot of your videos. I'm pretty familiar with your channel. I know that this is not your academic background or anything. So
Right.
Can you kind of give us a walkthrough of like what gave you this idea? Like why has this become such a phenomenon?
Yeah, so I've always been really into history since I was a little kid, but I was not at all into cooking. I was into eating, but never really cooking until I saw the Great British Bake Off, and I absolutely became enamored with that show. I've always been an Anglophile, so there was just something so charming about the Englishness, or the Britishness rather, of that show. And so when that came out, or rather when I was exposed to it, I decided I wanted to bake all of these things. And so I kind of taught myself to bake by watching the show and just trying to recreate everything that they were making on the show. And a lot of the dishes were historic in nature, even if they weren't working from historic recipes. They had a history behind them, like the Battenberg cake and scones and gingerbread. And once in a while, in the early seasons, they would actually have a segment about the history of the food. And I love that part. And I think that that's actually part of the thing that kind of got me into it, because it was like, oh, it's getting me into food via history. I'm the audience for that. So I started baking these things. And I was currently working, or at the time I was working at Walt Disney Studios, and I would bring in the baked goods to work. And then I would tell my coworkers about the history. I would basically just parrot the history sections from the show. And then when I ran out of those, I started kind of doing my own research and learning the history about other baked goods that maybe, I veered away from the show. And I was looking for something creative to do, kind of a creative outlet. I was working for the studio, which was creative, but it was being creative for Disney and not creative for me. And so I was looking for something that I could do that was, going to kind of scratch that itch, and as well as maybe make a little extra money on the side. And so I determined, okay, YouTube is the way to go, because I don't need anyone else to make that happen. I can just do it all on my own. But I didn't know what it would be. And then one of my coworkers at a Christmas party said, well, why don't you tell people those little lectures you keep telling us every Monday when you bring in your baked goods? I was like, okay, I can do that. And so that's what inspired Tasting History. And originally it was just supposed to be medieval recipes. That was kind of the original idea. And very quickly, I realized, well, this is going to be a short-lived show if I just stick to medieval recipes. Because a lot of things just don't have history associated with them. And two, I had a lot of people in the comments asking for other time periods and other cultures and everything. So I started to branch out and just grew from there.
As a medievalist, I mean, I do really appreciate the focus on the Middle Ages. I mean, they do seem to pop up quite a bit throughout the channel.
Yeah.
Um, so, if you were going to kind of like dissect the approach to tasting history, like, so how does it work for when you find a recipe? Like, do you find a recipe first? Do you find I want to do something about this time period, I want to do something about this topic? Like, how do you go from I need a video to that video is going to be about X, I'm going to do Y research, and the end result is going to be Z?
Yeah. So it really changes all the time. Sometimes it rarely starts off with a recipe, because the history section of the show has grown more and more and more. In those first few episodes I did, the history section would be like 3 or 4 minutes long, and it was mostly about the cooking. Well, now the majority of most of the videos are about history. And so now they can be 12 to 15 minutes worth of history. So that is usually what I look for when researching an episode. It's like, do I have something to talk about? Because, like I said, most recipes, most foods throughout history don't actually have any history associated with them, meaning we don't know exactly when something was made, or there are no interesting tales associated with a dish. So it's finding those tales or the history that I need to do. And once in a while I will decide to make a specific food. Like I just recorded a video on deep dish pizza, and because I wanted to make deep dish pizza. And so from there, I had to go searching for history, and I had to go searching for an old recipe, which was harder than I expected. But usually, it starts with the history. I've heard an interesting story or something like that. Case in point, there is a few weeks ago, I was in England, and one morning I got an email from a viewer saying, "Hey, have you ever heard of this dish called Ali? It's an Egyptian medieval dish that's kind of like bread pudding, and we eat it around Ramadan, and I think it would be cool to do a video on it." Well, I was like, "Oh, okay, I've never heard of that dish. There was no history or anything like that, so it's like, okay, I'll put it on my to-do list to see if there's anything back there." That exact same night, now this is a dish I'd never heard of. That exact same night, I went to a show, and a man came up to me and said, "Hey, I'm a fan of the channel." He was from Kuwait. I was thinking that you should do some videos on these different foods, and he named a few things, and then he mentioned Ali. I was like, "Oh, I just heard about that dish this morning." And he's like, "Oh yeah, it's great, and it has such a fantastic story behind it." And then he spent the next 10 minutes, basically the whole interval or intermission, telling me this story about this dish and where it gets its name. And it has to do with, it's a tale of scandal and murder. And it's really, really fascinating. So then I'm inspired to do the episode, because just having the dish, there just isn't enough there. So it usually, the history leads me on. And I will very often I don't know what I want to do a video on. And so I just go to my bookshelf behind me and I'll just start flipping through things. And the moment I get that, ooh, interesting, then that's the next week's video. Because there are so many, I have a list of like 400 video ideas, which is like 8 years worth of content. But whenever I look at it, a lot of the things don't really jump out to me at that moment. Later on, they might. Or earlier on, when I wrote it down, it was like, oh, this is going to be interesting. But if I'm not interested in it at that very second, I'm not going to make a video of it, because I know I'm going to spend the next 40 to 50 hours working on that video. So I need to be really into it at that time.
I was going to say that kind of leads into the next question, and is your research process. So I don't know what your particular academic background is, though, but you said it's not history. So how did you kind of bridge that gap between I'm interested in history to I'm now doing history? Like, I mean, because you're taking sources, going through, books and so on, putting together a narrative. How did you bridge that gap, basically?
Yeah. So, I mean, originally, what I used to love doing as a kid was reading the encyclopedia and then telling my family what I had just read. And it was basically just regurgitating the facts. And I feel like that's what I do now. I don't, I'm not the one actually necessarily coming up with all of this. It's more that I piece it together from many sources. I don't just read the encyclopedia. I don't just read Wikipedia anymore. It's more that that's a great starting place, but then I end up, because I love primary sources and I love reading them in my videos because I feel like it's an immediate way to connect with history is by reading the words of people in history. And so I just search for as many mentions of a certain food or mentions of a certain story as I can in different sources. And so I just kind of go down the rabbit hole. Usually, my research starts with something like Wikipedia or one of the books behind me that are encyclopedic in nature. It's like an overview of the history of food in medieval Italy. And then I'll find something in there that's interesting, and then I flip to the bibliography. And the bibliography is where, in high school it was like, why are we making bibliographies? This is stupid. I never really got it. Well, now that's my favorite part of any book, is the bibliography, because that's where you're finding where all these claims are coming from. And then I'll find a secondary source in the bibliography. I'll go find that source, and then I'll go to that bibliography, and eventually it leads me to those primary sources that I enjoy. But really, I think what I do, it's really all about curating. I kind of sometimes liken it to the difference between a news anchor and the journalist who is actually going out and interviewing people and kind of finding the news, what were the White House guys' names? I can't remember now. Who exposed Nixon? Their names have just gone out of my head. But they were the ones who were doing all of the work and doing all. And then the people who were actually on the news relating it, they were just the mouthpiece, and that's what I feel like I am. I'm the mouthpiece, and I curate all of this information and then I package it in a narrative, like you said, because I found that if it's not in a narrative, people won't listen to it. And so much of this stuff that I read in academic articles and journals and much, I don't want to say drier, but more academic books, most people will never ever get any of that information in that form because they're just not going to read it. But I have a pretty good sense of being able to take what is interesting in there and repackaging it as in a story.
And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to reach out is that, I mean, that's kind of what we do at Ask Historians. I mean, most of us are not trained academics. Like, I do not have a PhD. I don't teach at the university level. I mean, I have a master's degree and I am a teacher, but I am not a researcher, expert, things like that. And we have many other people who are both, active contributors and so on, some of whom have never taken a history class in their life, but because they've developed these skills, they've been able to start bringing that information to people in a way that was not previously available, either because the source material is either esoteric or it's too dense or it's locked in a database that most people don't have access to and they can't actually even access it to begin with. And that's one of the reasons that I was really interested in reaching out to people like you who do this kind of public outreach. And that leads into the next question is, where do you see yourself kind of in this ecosystem of, I don't want to say like internet historian personalities, whatever you want to call it, but like there's a group, I say group, I mean, there's hundreds of them, of people on YouTube and other places who do history and that have kind of taken off in a way that is not normal for academic historians to do. And so, what I was going to ask is kind of where do you see yourself fitting in there? Like, do you see yourself as just popularizing stuff that's already there? Do you have any interest in, either in shedding light on other areas, underserved areas? Like, for example, medieval Europe. A lot of people are already interested in medieval Europe, right? It's a pretty easily accessible part of history. Pre-Columbian cooking of Mesoamerica, a little bit less well known, right? So I was kind of curious, like, where do you see yourself fitting into that in the work that you're doing compared to what you see elsewhere?
Yeah. Gosh, I don't really know. I never think about it. Quite honestly, every week I just make a video about what interests me.
That's an
Um,
answer. I mean, that is an answer.
yeah, I have no plans to, I my goal is to never, rather, it's never my goal to shed light on a specific topic or anything like that. If I do, great, but there's very little, like, there's no agenda. There's no, um, my hope is to entertain people and give them something to talk about at their next dinner party, that I think is interesting, because quite honestly, the person who I'm trying to entertain is me. And I the person that I'm trying to teach is me. A lot of times people will ask me to do an interview, and they'll start asking me all of these questions about food history. And I have to tell them, if I haven't covered it in a video, I probably don't know it. Because literally what my videos are just me sitting at my kitchen counter telling you what I learned that week. It's usually all new to me. I mean, I have a basis in the history and everything, but when it comes to the details, um, it's just whatever I learned last week. And so there's, I cover a lot of medieval stuff because I enjoy that. I cover I'm covering what I enjoy, and a lot of people sometimes are like, well, why don't you do more of, and then name another culture or whatever. And I do. I've covered Japanese dishes and Indian dishes and Chinese and Mesoamerican dishes, but much more rarely. But the reasoning is typically several. One, it's a lot harder. I'm very lazy in, like, I try to do, I do the least work possible to get the most out of it. And when I'm researching something that has been written about and has a lot of primary sources associated with it that either are in English or have been translated, I might spend between 35 and 50 hours on a video. When I am doing something that I need to get access to Chinese the Chinese internet, which is different than the internet that I have access to, and get stuff translated from a version of Chinese that is not even legible to most modern day readers, it can be 70 or 80 hours worth of work. And so it's just more. So I do them, and I actually really enjoy doing those because, like I said, I enjoy learning stuff. It's all about teaching me stuff, and I learn a lot more when I cover those topics. But they're a lot more work, and this just comes from the nature of YouTube. They don't do as well. So not only is it more work, but it's far less reward view wise. And I don't always put out videos just for views because I've realized that I'm a terrible judge of what's going to do well and what's not. Um, but typically they don't do as well, which kind of sucks. I still cover them, but I don't cover them as often because they're more work and they don't get as many views. But then the other thing is we just know less about them. I also kind of painted myself into a corner that I'm trying to get out of. But when I started the channel, I work from historic recipes. And so if there isn't a recipe from history, I don't make a video about it. Um, and there are pretty much no recipes from certain parts of the world that are historic. Much of the world didn't have a tradition of writing down recipes until the 19th or even 20th century. So finding historic recipes can be very, very difficult. And I've started to break out of that. I recently did a video on Ötzi the Iceman. Well, obviously, he died 5,000 years ago. There was no recipe written down about what he ate. And yet I still did a video about him. And it ended up doing really well. And so I've realized, okay, I don't need to box myself into just using historic recipes. Um, I can do other things, and people will accept it and be fine with it if the history is interesting enough. And so that's now my kind of watch cry is let the history lead the episode, and I'll figure out how to make a dish around it.
I see. I was actually going to ask about that kind of economic calculation that goes into it. Time invested versus potential payoff. But you also said that you're not a very good judge of what is and is not going to do well. And can you speak a
Yeah,
little bit
no,
more about that? Like, is there cases where you thought, oh, I thought this was going to do really well, or if this came out of left field and did really well, but I wasn't expecting
yeah,
that?
yeah. I thought my video on the Lusitania was going to do very well. It's also one of my longest videos ever. The history is fascinating. The dish is complex and interesting, and it's one of the worst performing videos this year. I thought that my Ötzi the Iceman video would not be very strong. Um, and then it's one of the best performing videos of the year. And that actually happens. I'm pleasantly surprised more often than I am disappointed, I've found. Um, and that's why, I do still make recipes from the areas that I know typically don't do as well, because once in a while they will do really well. My video on the Shogun did really well, even though many of my Japanese videos go all but unwatched. And the thing is, I say all but unwatched, and that's not really the case anymore, because even my poor performing videos now do very well, which is really nice because the channel has grown and my audience, sticks with me. But it's kind of, I mean, if you do YouTube, you know that there's your core audience, but to really get a video really going, it has to get outside of your core audience, and so there's that. And I want to say I don't feel, I don't care about the views and stuff, but when your entire life is just looking at your analytics, you do care about the views, and when something doesn't do well, it ruins your whole day. um, and when something does well, I mean, it's terrible, and I wish it wasn't that way. I wish that I had, a better way of looking at things, but it's kind of the way that it goes. I think I've done a good job at not, you know using clickbait or anything like that, because I still want the show to be the show. I even though I know that certain videos would do better views if I named it something different or showed something on the thumbnail or whatever. If the title and thumbnail are not indicative of what the video is about, I'm not going to do that just to get views.
I gotcha. I'm curious though. Do you ever like plan it? Like, so for example, the Shogun dish, the that came out at about the same time that the TV show Shogun was starting to catch on in online discourse, getting very popular. Like, do you ever try and match them up like that?
Well, so that one, the reason was because the video itself was sponsored by the TV show. But even when I'm not going to be sponsored by a TV show, because that's only happened, that time and during one other movie, I do try to maybe fit things in when certain things are kind of hitting the zeitgeist. I try to look at like what movies are coming up or what shows are coming up or certain holidays. But I've also found that, with the exception, I'm not going to put a Christmas video out in August. But other than that, other than Christmas, Halloween, and Thanksgiving, and maybe Easter, it doesn't really matter when something comes out. It at first it might, but after a few weeks or whatever, I think everything kind of levels out, and it's going to do what it's going to do. Um, but there have been times where, and it's usually not on purpose. It's usually quite the opposite. I'll put out a video, and it's about a topic, that doesn't do that well, or maybe the video does do all right, but then something happens down the line, and that influences people coming back to this video, or this video getting resurfaced. Like last year when that horrible tragedy when the sub went down to the Titanic and imploded, my Titanic videos did very, very well at that time, simply because people were searching for Titanic. I mean, it's a terrible reason for my videos to resurface, but it happened. And it does happen like that when TV shows or certain things kind of pop up. Holidays. Every year at Thanksgiving, my Thanksgiving videos pop back up. And that's just kind of how it is.
I was going to say the Texas pecan pie recipe. I'm responsible for more than a few of those
Oh yes.
videos watches around Christmas and Thanksgiving.
Yep.
That's become like my dish that I make at our
Yes.
Thanksgiving and Christmases.
It's the same with me. There are very few dishes that I ever make outside of the show, but that is one of them. I make it every Thanksgiving and Christmas now.
I was going to say, so are there any actually that have become a part of your repertoire? Because I mean, some of these dishes are a little out there.
Yeah.
I mean, the jellyfish, the Roman black feast. I don't see that appearing on the weekly shopping list most days.
No, definitely not.
But have there been any other ones that have kind of become a part of your regular cooking?
Not really. The only things that kind of become a part of it is things that I make when I go home to my family. Most of the things that I make there, I spend all day cooking for the show or researching or whatever. So usually the last thing I want to do is make a complex dish for fun, for just me eating. And most of the things I do make are, because they're historic. It's like the most lengthy way to make any dish is the way to make these dishes. But there are certain holiday dishes that I do kind of revisit, or it's mostly around the holidays, honestly. And then there are so many dishes that aren't good, like you said, the Roman jellyfish, and other things, because one thing that I never take into account when planning an episode is how the dish tastes. Partly because I don't know how it tastes until I actually taste it, and I have been pleasantly surprised in some and somewhat disappointed in others. But that is not the point. I don't think of myself as a cooking show. So my goal is to not to get you to, make delicious foods. There are so many shows out there that is what they do. My goal is to make something interesting, tell an interesting story, and then taste it and give you my unvarnished opinion on how it tastes, and my opinion on if I screwed up or if, it just can't be replicated the way that it was. So I end up with a lot of not great dishes because of that.
I was going to say, so of the ones that you have made, what was the most surprising in a good way, and what was the, oh God, I can't eat this?
Honestly, one of the most surprising. So there have been a few. One was something called Hellfire Stew. Actually, what's funny is both of these dishes are going to include hardtack, which has become a bit of a meme on my channel. So one of them was Hellfire Stew, which was a Civil War dish that is just crumbled up hardtack and bacon kind of mixed together and fried. And it's so simple, and it seems like it would be kind of not great. It was actually delicious. And another one that I just did today was a Civil War era mock apple pie So it's an apple pie with no apples in it, and it's not that it tasted good. It did, but it's the fact that it tastes like apple pie, even though it has no apples. It was mind-boggling. It was really interesting. Um, Dishes that did not taste great that I thought would taste great. Um, Nothing comes to mind. There are so many, but I think that they often. Oh, you know what? The peanut butter and tomato soup. I actually thought that was going to be good because I love both of those things, and it was terrible. I made it for this school lunch episode that I did, history of school lunches, and I really thought that was going to be good because there is a tomato and peanut butter soup that is made in West Africa that is delicious today. It's a modern dish. So I was like, oh, those flavors will work together. They did not in that recipe at least.
So you've mentioned that you see yourself as a history channel, not a cooking channel, and that you kind of take these stories and turn them into a digestible format in a way that most people really wouldn't have the access to in their regular day-to-day lives. Do you consider yourself a historian?
Um, no, nor do I consider myself a chef. People often say, "Oh, you're a chef." No, I cook food on TV or on YouTube. That's different than a chef. I've worked in restaurants. I know what a chef does, and I could not do what a chef does. Uh, so I
Well,
don't
I'm
have.
curious then, it's like, how do you see yourself not as a historian? Because you're taking primary sources, you're turning it into a format that other people can take, you're synthesizing pre-existing, secondary, primary sources.
So I think if I consider myself a historian, I would have to consider myself a poor historian, because I feel like a good historian tries their best to contextualize things without putting in their own opinion. Um, and I never really shy away from that. Um, I think that I also use stories from history and I'm always upfront that hey, this is what Pliny the Elder said about talking cows in ancient Rome. I don't believe that there were talking cows in ancient Rome, but I'm still going to share this because I think it's interesting and cool. Whereas a lot of historians simply dismiss it and will not include that kind of material in their works. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. But that's I, I think that a good historian has different goals than I do. Um, my goal is to teach, but it's also to entertain. I don't think that those two things are mutually exclusive, but I also will leave things out if it's not particularly entertaining. And I think, I won't leave something out if it changes the narrative. I don't mean that. I will just leave it out if it's like, oh, this is something that happened that if I was a historian writing a historic paper, I would absolutely include. But it's really boring to just rattle this off, so I'm not going to include it. And it doesn't change what else I'm talking about, but I'll leave stuff out. So there's a lot of editing that I do that I feel like an academic historian would not do. And and so I would say that I am a lover of history and a storyteller, and I do my best to make those stories as historically accurate as possible. But I just wouldn't use the word historian personally. It's the same reason that I don't use the word chef to describe me. I have such respect for what those people do that I know I can't do it the way that they do it, and so I'm not going to use the word to describe myself.
I get that. That makes sense.
I would never hold
Um,
it against somebody else that did. It's very much a personal thing. But I I think that if I do call myself historian, it people will expect something different from what I'm offering. And, it is still entertainment.
So when you see it as entertainment and so on, do you ever find yourself, as a result of your own research or your own interest and so on, pushing back against narratives, ideas, and so on that you've seen before, been exposed to, but find are not true? So, for example, the Middle Ages get a really bad rap in a lot of pop history, in a lot of common depictions of the past, and so on. And again, this is me being the medievalist trying to talk about how great it actually, not great, to be clear, great in terms of interesting, artistic, lots of
Yeah.
stuff going on, not great to live in. Let's be clear about that. I would not want to, don't drop me off
No.
1000 AD in England. That would not be great. But as a part of your own research and so on, has this been a process where you've either been finding myths that you previously believed and have been starting pushing against, or things that you knew were maybe not true, and now that you're able to kind of show them off a little bit more?
Yes. Both. And it's very often the former. Things that, because when you're told something, especially if it's from a credible source, you believe it, because we don't have time. You have to. You Nobody has time to fact check everything that they're told. You would just be paralyzed. Um, and so we have to accept certain things that we have been told. And I have some sources that I have immense respect for, um, and I have realized that they have been incorrect on things. And the thing is, I don't think that, I never think it was malicious. I just think that there are so many things that have become accepted history, or have become something that TV and film and theater has done, is because it's just always in our zeitgeist and we're watching it and everything, we just accept certain aspects from those, even though they were actually made by that concept was made by a costume designer back in the 1920s and just hasn't changed in the last 100 years or whatever. But there are I come across those things so often, especially with things like food, because everybody always wants to tell the interesting little tidbit, about this, and medieval history is exactly the same. And a lot of those interesting little tidbits, they come from the 18th and 19th century, when people would just make up history. If they didn't know it, they would just kind of make it up, to entertain. And while I entertain, I don't just make it up. And so there are certain myths that I've come across that have been debunked as I do more research. Even if my goal is not to debunk them, it's just like, while I'm doing the research, it's like, wait a second, something doesn't jive here. So that happens quite often. I have actually done a couple videos where I really go into that. One on Leonardo da Vinci. A lot of what we think about Leonardo da Vinci there's no reason to believe any of it's true. A lot about medieval things, and the problem is, I'm sure that I have parroted some mistruths, because, like I said, it's almost impossible to fact check everything. You have to accept some things, as truth, and it's figuring out what to accept and what not. There's I remember at the beginning of my mead video, I talked about honeymoon, and how that was an Anglo-Saxon tradition that came from mead being drunk over a month's period, and that's not true. That was a story that came out of the 18th century and was, put in hundreds and hundreds of books and articles and everything. And it's only recently that, people have gone back and been like, well, where did this come from? And there, so often too, we don't know that these things are false. It's just that there's no evidence to suggest that they aren't. That when things just appear for the first time in a 19th century, book where there are also a bunch of other dubious claims. It's just like, okay, this is probably just made up. I don't know where, I don't know why I'm answering. I don't even remember the question. I just remember. Oh yeah, yeah. It was about this. No. There are a lot of kind of mistruths out there and stories about food. One of them that I just covered. I'm sure the video will be out by the time this is up because it's Tuesday's video on the origins of deep dish pizza. The story that Pizzeria Uno, who made the first deep dish pizza, their own narrative is patently false. And there is a wonderfully researched gentleman, Peter Regas, who has gone down the rabbit hole and searched like different documents, legal documents from the opening of the store and everything to prove that this origin story just couldn't possibly be true. But that's been the accepted story for 60 years. I mean, that is literally what's on their website and what is on a plaque outside of their house, outside of their restaurant. So, it is just what it is.
I remember because I think you've gotten into this in some of your other videos too. I can't remember. I want to say it was the buffalo wings episode.
Yeah.
There's multiple different narratives about how the dish was originally created. I mean, and it's definitely interesting to hear that like this has been a process that has been happening, kind of throughout your work on this. So as a part of your process, you obviously work with a lot of secondary and primary research materials. And I mean, some things are going to be relatively easy to find, I would assume. Like if you're going to be looking at something like the, different ways that people prepared food in the United States in the 1940s, there's going to be a lot more stuff there than what were Anglo-Saxons doing in the 9th century.
Yeah.
But there's also elements, obviously, of language as well that get into it. If you're English native speaker, you can get through things made in the United States, go back in Britain, back to about the year 1200, you can probably get through most of that. But when you're looking at dishes either from the ancient world, such as, Roman dishes, Egyptian dishes, even assuming that the recipes are written down in a recognizable format, or are from a linguistic experience that is just so wildly different to English, whether that's Chinese, Japanese, etc. How do you go through the process of actually finding the sources, incorporating them into the video, and actually getting a finished product that is, if not the most accurate thing that has ever happened, that this is the exact same dish that appeared 4,000 years ago, is at least an approximation of it that can still pass muster through, the use of sources?
Yeah. So finding sources is always, one of the biggest issues. I mean, quite honestly, with the internet, it's become, I couldn't have done this 20 years ago. I couldn't have done this show. There's just so much that has been put online from different museums and universities and libraries. And so you can actually just go see a lot of these documents, but there are so many that you can't. And a lot of times it's because it is in a different language that is, Google Translate is pretty awesome. And it just keeps getting better and better. I would never use it to necessarily translate word for word something, but it is a great way to figure out, is this even worth me looking at? If I find a document that's in Latin that just hasn't been translated, like a lot of, I like looking at like letters and stuff from the medieval period that are written in Latin, some of which have been translated, but many of which haven't. And so it's kind of like, okay, do they mention food anywhere in this, kind of thing? But then usually I need some help translating it, getting a good translation. But that becomes more difficult when it is a language that maybe Google Translate is not so good at, which there are many, or something that doesn't use our alphabet. So if it's something in Cyrillic or using Chinese or Japanese characters or Arabic, I have no way to type that in to Google Translate to even find out if it's worth pursuing. Um, then there are a lot of documents that I know are out there. I know they exist because I've read secondary sources, books on the subject that reference it. But finding that primary source is just not possible because while there has been a lot put online, not everything has been. Um, and there are certain places that are more uh, that have shared more of their sources. You know, if it's a Western European source or an American source or from Mexico, it's probably been uploaded online. But many of the things from South America, from China, from India that I've tried to find, it's like, oh, this is, and it'll tell you where it is. It's at the so and so library in whatever city, and you don't have access to it. So unless you know somebody in that city who has the time to go look for it, you're not going to get it. And even then, they're probably not going to be able to read it because, you know, every language has changed so much in the last few hundred years that it's hard to read. So it's frustrating, and very often I just end up either abandoning those episodes, or if I've already put a lot of work into it, just figuring out another way to tell the story, and relying more heavily on secondary sources, which can be dangerous, but mostly it's fine. I just really like the primary sources, but I don't always get to them.
I got you. I mean, it's very similar to a struggle that a lot of historians run into. Like you said, if you are looking at something from England, the United States, there's great archives, there's great digitalization programs for most things. I mean, not obviously not everything gets digitized or translated and so on, but other things like, for example, if you're looking at for example, Vatican records from certain years, you got nothing. Like
Got nothing.
it might be in some monastery somewhere,
Yep.
maybe.
Yep. What is amazing is that while I do this, I've realized that it is such an ongoing process, because usually when you look up these things, there's a date of when it was digitized and added to a certain archive. And so often it's in the last year or 2 or 3 years. I can't remember now what it was, but I was recently doing a video and I found this document that it was gold, and it really made the video. And I looked at when it had been digitized and uploaded. I think it was from the British Library. When it had been uploaded, it had been a week before I was doing the research for that video. So it's like, even if there's a video I can't make right now, in a couple years I might be able to, because the information will be there. I mean, I wish I had the opportunity to go to all these places, but one, I don't have the time nor the funds. But it's mostly I put out a video every week, so it's like if I can't find the information sitting at my desk, I can't find the information.
I gotcha. That actually gets to a kind of a similar question then. So, how do you take the same process but relate it to things like certain foods that are not necessarily very common these days? For example, many of the medieval recipes call upon spices and so on that either have changed through their names or might not necessarily be as common anymore. I know was the currants, that has changed what that refers to, once or twice in the history of how we relate to that item of food and what we call it and so on. So, can you walk us a little bit through how the process of figuring out, oh, that word means this, then it means something different now, or other things
Right.
that just might not be easily accessible. For example, I know you've done a video on boar. Most people probably can't just run to the grocery store and grab a slice of boar.
Right. So, I mean, online you can find a lot of things that are difficult to find, but not always. Especially when it comes to meat, you can usually find, maybe you can find the animal, but you can't find a certain cut. So it's like if it requires leg of boar, good luck, because that is almost always ground up and sold as dog food, almost always. So unless you're finding a whole a whole food butcher that deals in boar, and there are probably a handful, in the U.S., then it can be very difficult. I've always wanted to make a video on dormouse and flamingo tongue from ancient Rome. Well, I'm not going to get either of those. So, I just have to find something else that's going to kind of like it, I guess. Um, as far as ingredients changing, the problem is sometimes it's hard to tell if a if a certain word refers to something different, because at no point did they write down that it referred to something different. So it takes a lot of guesswork and stuff, and it's like trying to figure out, okay, well, what date did this change over? And it's the same thing with weights and measurements. It's like, oh, it's a pound. Well, is that a pound in France in the early 18th century, or is it in England? And if it's in France, is it in Paris or Lyon? Because they're vastly different, So there's a lot of guesswork there, and we know many things that have changed, but not everything, you know. And then the other thing is ingredients themselves have changed. So my goal always with making these dishes, I make them in a modern kitchen. I don't do period cooking necessarily, um, and so it's always I'm trying to get the idea of the dish, because exactly what it was will just making exactly what it was will never happen. Every single ingredient has changed, even wheat and chicken and apples and sugar, and everything has changed. So even if you can use the most, organic or the earliest form of it, it's going to be different. Everything is just different. Some things are more different than others. Bananas, for example, are vastly different than they were even 60 years ago. But some things have changed more or less. The nice thing is, with a lot of the spices and stuff from history that are very difficult to find because we don't use them in Western cooking, a lot of those spices still exist where they originated, which is the Far East and the Middle East in some cases. So if you have a Middle Eastern grocery store or a Thai store or an Indian market, you can find a lot of these spices that we just don't use anymore today. But not everybody even has that option. So Amazon sometimes is your friend on those.
So it's been great talking to you about all these different topics, the role of YouTube in history, the role of you see yourself playing in the historical outreach landscape. If you were going to leave our audience with any kinds of words of advice about whether to cultivate an interest in history, interest in cooking, historical cooking, whatever the case may be, what do you think would be the best advice to leave with somebody who's saying to themselves, I'm kind of interested in this. How can I start going down this path and figuring out what am I interested in? How am I going to go about doing that?
Yeah. Well, from a research standpoint, fall in love with bibliographies. That's my always my thing. I've worked with several people who have helped me do research, and it very often doesn't work out because they rely too much on what a certain book says and don't kind of go down the rabbit hole of checking to see, is that so? Because so often, even when places are quoting things, you go and read the full quote, and it's like, well, you took that out of context. So from a research perspective, just fall in love with bibliographies and primary sources. They're just a lot of fun. But from a historic cooking perspective, I would just say, just start doing it, and don't take it too seriously, because a lot of people do, and they're like, well, this isn't exactly the way that it was. No, it is not. And you never will get it exactly the way that it was done. And so you just have to be okay with that and have fun with it. Otherwise, you'll get paralyzed and just not be able to make anything. For me, historic cooking it's really just about kind of putting myself in the shoes of a historical figure for a few bites. And even if it's not exactly what they ate, because it can't be, it can give me a glimpse of what they were eating and what they were going through and the flavors that were there at the time, and so it brings you closer to history, even if it's just for a little bit. But just don't take it too seriously, and just have fun with it. And yeah, that's it.
All right, well, we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you for coming on the show. And if you're not familiar with it, please check out his channel, Tasting History, on YouTube. I believe there's a website and a cookbook out now. I would recommend checking out those as well. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com, and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.